While the Xterra came into the shop for what's most likely a blown head gasket, there's just too many issues that need to be addressed, so the motor needs to come out. I have a bad rear main seal leak, a piece broken off of the oil pump, and it's just a good time to reseal the entire engine with new gaskets, so pulling the engine is the right call. In this episode, we begin the process of removing the engine and getting it ready to pull out of the Xterra. First order of business is to get the hood off, which means I need to disconnect the windshield washer plumbing. Keeping things simple, I disconnected the feed tube coming from the windshield washer reservoir at the Y connector on the hood. Then I pulled the tube through the plastic retaining clips instead of trying to remove the clips from the hood and risk breaking them. If I pull this, all right, you hold it right there. Here it comes, it's gonna slide. What? Huh? No, stay on that side and hold it, because that's how we'll pick it up and move it. Okay, here it comes. Okay, up it goes. With the hood off, I'll have plenty of access to the back side of the engine and we'll be able to pull the engine straight up out of the engine bay. So what I'm doing right now is I'm going through and ensuring that all coolant lines are disconnected from the engine. I know I've got one that runs to the heater core, right there. You can see it runs all back behind there and then goes right into the lower portion of the firewall. Now, I just replaced the heater hoses less than 500 miles ago when I replaced the lower intake manifold gasket. The location for this hose that I'm taking off now is tucked in the very back of the engine, low against the block. I plan on reusing these hoses since they're still new, and I'm taking my time here and working the hose off the heater pipe with a set of hose clamp pliers. Once off the pipe, the hose can be tucked against the firewall behind the passenger side cylinder head. Now, I've got to go underneath and start disconnecting the engine from the transmission, starting with removing the starter. First, disconnect the starter from the harness, followed by removing the power cable from the starter itself. With the starter disconnected, it's time to unbolt it from the bell housing. It's held on by two 14mm bolts that are accessible on the back side of the transmission. Here you'll see I'm just using a ratcheting wrench with different mixes of extensions to get in there and get the bolts off. My passenger side exhaust is hanging a little lower than normal due to being disconnected from the manifold at the collector. You can see here how the cap kind of gets in the way of my wrench. The starter is really shoehorned in there, and I actually went off camera and patiently took my time working it out of the truck. Once you've got the starter unbolted, it's tucked in there pretty good. Because I have my collectors, my exhaust manifold collectors disconnected, they're actually sagging down, so I didn't have as much clearance as when I installed this new starter a couple years ago. And so you got to get creative when you're in there, but essentially the way I did it was, if this is parallel with the ground right now, mounted in the bell housing, like you're from the driver's side. Basically, I pulled it out, spun it over, and was able to get some clearance by pushing the exhaust manifold, or excuse me, the downpipe up, and then it slips down. There's not much room under there, so just be very patient and make sure you've got plenty of good light. Sorry I couldn't get a good camera shot of that. I had to go off camera and fight with this thing for about half an hour, and it's kind of like a jigsaw puzzle, just figure a perfect way to get it out. Plus I've got tons of caked on grease underneath the engine, which probably helped get the bolts out because my rear main seal that's bad. So it's a little nasty underneath there, but this is out. This is a good starter. This only probably has like 15,000 miles on it. So definitely gonna clean it up and reuse it. Now that the starter's out, I can go in and start unbolting the bell housing, and then probably after that motor mounts, then do a final check around the engine for ground straps and other electrical cords that may be secured to the block, not connected to the block, but just having some kind of clip bolted off of either the head or the block. And this thing's getting close to getting ready to come out. In order to lift the engine out, the transmission cooler lines need to be disconnected and moved to the side away from the engine block. The lines actually run up and over the rear passenger side corner of the engine block. There's 3 locations to unbolt retaining brackets from on the passenger side of the block and just above the oil pan. Then there's 2 retaining bolts just in front of the transmission, where one line runs back to the driver's side of the transmission. Next, I'll remove the 19mm banjo bolts, keeping the lines plumbed into the transmission. There's also one final retaining bolt on the driver's side of the transmission, next to the banjo bolt. Space is tight, but I was able to easily get a 19mm ratcheting wrench on the passenger side and a standard 19mm socket on the driver's side. Be prepared for some fluid to run out of the lines once you move them out of the way. Okay, I've still got some bolts remaining, keeping the engine fastened to the transmission. Plus, I've still got to undo the torque converter bolts, as well as just go around and make sure that I've got no other sensors or lines or anything connected to the engine block, the heads, or anything coming off or coming out with the motor. But I ended up spilling a whole bunch of transmission fluid again from the cooler lines. So I've got that all soaking up right now in some kitty litter. And I still need to figure out where I'm going to attach my hoist to on the engine. Let me bring you in here really quick and show you where I'm thinking. So I've got right on the front of the cylinder head, I can take this stud out. And I just happened to find a matching set of grade 10 bolts that go perfectly in there from my Toyota pile. So cool. If you need to go and get bolts from the hardware store to adapt your hoist into the cylinder heads, they are M8 by 1.25 and mine are 16 millimeters long. Okay, I end up hooking up to the throttle and cruise control linkage plate and the front of the cylinder head. So just like I was talking about earlier, I pulled that stud out and I've got one of the attachments right at the front of the passenger side cylinder head. And then bring you down in here and I'm just going right off of the linkage plate that honestly in certain years may actually be a lift point because that's where the factory sling attachment can be located at. I've got my mess all cleaned up underneath the Xterra, and now I'm going to go in and get the remaining bolts holding the engine of the bell housing of the transmission. And you're going to see me use this massive extension. This is actually a specific extension to remove bolts from a bell housing. I'm going to insert this behind the transfer case and shoot it through openings and use a flex joint with the 14mm socket to get all the bolts pretty easy. You can get the bolts off without one of these, but man, this makes life so much easier for removing engines in general and disconnecting transmissions. I've used this on countless transmissions and countless engines, and yeah, I don't know how I would have got, well, I know how I would have gotten some of them with a whole bunch of variations of extensions, which is how I did it before I realized these things existed, but this is way better and just easier to maneuver up there. When you have a whole bunch of extensions, you end up having them kind of droop and sag as you go. And depending what you pull out of your toolbox, some of them don't stay together. So I definitely recommend picking one of these up. The first bell housing bolt I'm taking out is on the passenger side, about midway up the transmission bell housing. I'm using my bell housing bolt extension tool along with a flex joint and a standard 14mm 6-point socket. Here I'm removing the passenger side bell housing bracket that attaches from the side of the engine block to the bell housing where the starter mounts. I'm using a long extension to access the bolt running through the back bracket to the transmission from the front. I removed the 2 bolts attaching the bracket to the engine block with a wrench and a socket, but the footage I got wasn't great, and you can easily see those bolt locations when you're right underneath the engine. You can see as I remove the bracket how it mounts right to the engine and then back to the transmission. There's another bell housing bolt that bolts from the front that is just below where the starter would sit. The cooler lines need to be out of the way, which is why we removed them first so that we would have access to this bolt. Similar to the passenger side bracket I just removed, there's a driver's side bracket that also needs to come off. There's 2 bolts mounting it to the bell housing and 2 bolts mounting it to the engine block. I'm just removing the bolts holding it to the bell housing for now because I want to clean up the area on the block before removing it to gain access to the torque converter bolts. The lower bolt on the bell housing is easy to get with a ratchet, while the top bolt is easier to access from the front with an extension. The last bell housing bolt I'm taking out while underneath the truck is on the driver's side of the bell housing, about midway up. Just like on the other side, I'm using my bell housing extension tool, but you can see here that there's much more access to the bolt as compared to the passenger side. Now it's time to move to the top of the transmission bell housing and get the 2 top bolts that are easily accessible from the top side of the engine. You've got just enough access to get down in there with any good style wrench and break these free. They're on there with a decent amount of torque. So in this case, I'm using a 1/2-inch breaker bar that's got a swivel head on the end of it, so I can get just enough clearance between there and the firewall. And I plan on doing the same thing for the driver's side, because remember, we've got 2 of them. And I'm just breaking them loose, and then I'll get a ratcheting wrench down there and I'll spin these off and get them. And then after that, I think we've got the crank position sensor and some grounds and the torque converter. And then it's coming out. I've got these extremely long extended reach ratcheting wrenches that are 12 spline. I've used them in some other videos, but you could use pretty much any wrench to get down there, even if it's not ratcheting. So I'm just calling that out because you don't need a special tool to get to this. This is just convenient for me, especially after they've been broken free. Once you get a couple turns with the ratcheting wrench, it's pretty easy just to get these out with your fingers. So we've still got to get the crankshaft position sensor out. It's tucked back behind the driver's side cylinder head. Right there, I've got a 1/4-inch drive ratchet with a 10mm socket that I'm going to break it loose and get it out with. I'll show you a picture of it once I get it out, but it's really hard to get it on camera right now. All right, I'll get in there and show you what the sensor looks like. So you can see it's on the main injector harness right here. So just leave it in the valley and pull it out. The whole harness is disconnected right now. And if I zoom in, right there, there's the bracket that holds it in. So the bracket's bolted down, keeping the sensor in place. And your downstream O2 sensor is attached to that, so make sure that's behind the bell housing and doesn't get caught up. That's going to do it for this part 1 episode of removing the motor out of the Xterra. In part 2, I'll be pulling the motor and getting it on the engine stand for inspection and teardown. Thanks for watching.